My name is Alexis, and I'm 28 years old. Growing up, my family had always seen my sister as the golden child, but I was the quiet one, the afterthought. It all came to a head on Christmas Eve. In front of everyone, my father called me a garbage man and told me I was a disappointment. What they didn't know was that while they laughed, I was silently building a wine empire. That night I walked out, vowing never to return. But when my face appeared on the front page of a national magazine, with my wine being served in the finest restaurants in America, my family's laughter turned to panic. What happens when the one you cast aside becomes everything you ever wanted to be? I promise, the truth is more shocking than you could ever imagine. Let me take you back to where it began. The house smelled like cinnamon and pine. It was the scent of a perfect New England Christmas. Growing up, the Reed family Christmas Eve party was the stuff of legends. My mom, Eleanor, spent weeks decorating every corner of our old Boston brownstone. The staircase was wrapped in garland. The mantelpiece was lined with dozens of flickering candles, and every single ornament on our towering Fraser fir had a story my mom would tell anyone who would listen. My dad, Robert, would be in his element, holding court in the living room, the fireplace crackling merrily behind him, a glass of his expensive bourbon in his hand. This was the night my sister Jessica and I were supposed to put aside all our differences and just be a family. This was the night that would shatter all of that forever. I got there a little late. The snow was falling in thick, quiet clumps, and my flight from California had been delayed. As I pulled my rental car into the driveway, I noticed the lights were already on in every window, a beacon of warmth that felt more like a trap than a welcome. I walked in just after 7 o'clock, brushing the flakes from my coat as I stepped inside. My mom greeted me with a quick hug, her eyes already scanning over my shoulder to see who else might be coming. When she saw I was alone, she just nodded and went back to fussing over a platter of cookies. I smiled to myself. Typical. I could already hear the cacophony of cheerful chatter from the living room. My cousin from Connecticut was there, a couple of aunts and uncles, and a handful of my dad's old business partners. They were all part of the elite little world my dad had built for himself, a world Jessica had so effortlessly slipped into. She was at the center of it all, of course, a glass of Chardonnay in her hand. She was wearing a beautiful sapphire blue dress that matched her eyes and laughing that bright, confident laugh of hers. She saw me and her smile wavered for a second before hardening again. "Look who finally decided to show up," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I guess they don't have flights for, people like us. I mean, they're probably used to flying cargo." A few polite forced laughs followed. I felt a familiar pang of hurt, but I was used to it. I had been ignoring her jabs for so long, they barely registered anymore. I went to the kitchen to get a glass of water, trying to find Ryan on my phone to tell him I had arrived safely. He'd wanted to come with me to be my shield against the inevitable jabs and condescension, but his company was launching a new marketing campaign, and he'd had to stay back. I found him texting me, "You okay? Heard about the delay. I love you." A small smile touched my lips. He was my anchor. He was my home. When I got back to the living room, my dad beckoned me over. His face was a little flushed, probably from the 2 or 3 bourbons he'd already had. "Alexis," he said, his voice booming across the room. "Come here. I want you to tell everyone what you've been doing with your life. Tell them all about your little wine thing." He made it sound like a child's hobby, a quaint pastime for someone who couldn't handle a real job. I felt my stomach clench. Jessica chimed in. "Oh, Dad, you know Alexis. She just likes to get her hands dirty. Don't you, Lex? It's so rustic." A few of the business partners chuckled politely. One of them, a tall man in a pinstriped suit, leaned in toward my father. "I hear she's just a glorified field hand, Robert. Why she wouldn't just take a proper job, I'll never know." That was the last straw. The blood rushed to my head. My heart pounded against my ribs. I opened my mouth to defend myself, to tell them all about Harvest and Stone, about the millions of dollars we'd made, and the acres of vineyards we owned. I wanted to see the look on their faces when they realized I was the one supplying the very wine they were probably drinking in their fancy restaurants and country clubs. But before I could get a word out, my dad cut me off. He took another long sip of his bourbon. "It's a shame, honestly," he said, shaking his head. "I spent my whole life building something, a legacy, and I wanted my children to carry that on. But one of my daughters chose to work in a field digging in the dirt. It's embarrassing. I've always told her that if you don't do something with your life, you're just a parasite, a garbage man. And frankly, I don't want a garbage man in my home on Christmas." The room went silent. I could feel every pair of eyes on me, some with pity, some with judgment. My mom was pretending to be busy arranging the ornaments on the tree. Jessica just smiled. I looked at my dad, at the man who was supposed to love me unconditionally, and I finally understood. All the years of being an afterthought, of my accomplishments being ignored, of my very being an inconvenience. It all came crashing down on me in that moment. There was nothing I could do or say to make him see me. The pain was so sharp it almost took my breath away, but a strange calm washed over me, a quiet kind of peace. All these years I had been trying to win a game I was never meant to play. The game was over, I had lost, but I had won my freedom. I stood up straight, put my glass of water down on the table, and looked at my father. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I just spoke. "I see," I said, my voice steady. "You think I'm a garbage man? Then I'll leave, and I will make sure you never see this garbage man again." I walked out the front door and let it slam shut behind me. The noise was muffled by the thick, heavy snow that had turned the streetlights into blurry halos. The frigid air hit me like a physical blow, a sharp, cleansing contrast to the suffocating heat inside. I fumbled in my purse for my car keys, my fingers stiff with cold, and finally unlocked the little black rental car. I didn't look back at the house, a house that no longer felt like home. I just got in, started the engine, and pulled out into the quiet, snowy street. The drive was a blur. The city of Boston, usually so familiar, felt foreign and unwelcoming. Every turn seemed to lead me back to a memory I wanted to leave behind. I passed the park where my dad taught Jessica how to throw a softball, and where I sat on the sidelines trying to get his attention by drawing pictures in the dirt. I passed the ice cream shop where Jessica got a double scoop of chocolate every time she won a debate competition. I'd never gotten a treat for my straight A's. My mom would just say, "That's what you're supposed to do." My parents' favoritism for Jessica wasn't a secret. It was the air we breathed. Jessica was a force of nature, a born leader. She was loud, confident, and had a smile that could charm anyone, especially our dad. He saw himself in her. She was ambitious, she wanted to be a lawyer, and he loved that. He'd tell everyone that his daughter, the brilliant Jessica, was going to be a litigator one day. He'd talk about her future as if it were a family project. My future, on the other hand, was never discussed. I was the quiet one, the artistic one, the one who loved to read and draw and get lost in my own world. They never understood it. They never tried. When I graduated from high school with a perfect grade point average and a scholarship to a great university, my dad just nodded. "Good," he said, and went back to watching the news. When Jessica got into law school, they threw her a huge party. My mom had a cake made that looked like a gavel. It was the kind of thing that would have made anyone feel like they were the lesser child, but I had learned to internalize it. I told myself it didn't matter. I had my own dreams, my own path. I didn't need their approval. But a small part of me, a very deep and lonely part, always hoped. My phone rang and I saw Ryan's name on the screen. A wave of relief so intense I almost swerved hit me. He was the one person in my life who saw me for me, who saw my worth without me having to prove a thing. I pulled over to the side of the road and answered the call. "Hey," he said, his voice soft and concerned. "Are you okay? I've been worried sick." "I can't believe they'd do that, not on Christmas." "They did," I said, my voice cracking. "The dam broke." I told him everything, the words tumbling out in a rush of anger and tears. I told him about my dad's comment, about Jessica's smirk, about how my mom just looked away. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I thought he might be mad, that he might think I was overreacting, but he wasn't. "I don't even know why I bothered going," I finally said, a sob catching in my throat. "It's always the same thing. I'm always the disappointment." "That's not true, Alexis," he said, his voice firm now. "You are not a disappointment. You are the most incredible, brilliant, kind woman I have ever met. They are the ones with the problem, not you." His words hit me harder than my dad's ever could. He wasn't giving me pity, he was giving me the truth. He was giving me strength. "I just don't know what to do," I said, the tears finally slowing. "I can't go back there. I can't look at them again. So don't," he said. "Don't go back. Don't look at them. You're already miles ahead of them. You've already won, Alexis. You just don't see it yet. They think they've humiliated you, but they've just set you free." He was right. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. The pain was still there, a dull ache in my chest, but it was different now. It was no longer a wound. It was a scar. Then he asked me a question that would change the course of my life forever. "What are you going to do now?" he said, his voice low and serious. "Give up or keep going? Are you going to keep trying to prove them right, or are you going to prove them wrong?" I hung up the phone and sat there in the silent, snow-filled car for a long time. Ryan's question echoed in the quiet space. He was right. All this time I had been trying to win a game I was never meant to play. But I was done. I was done seeking their approval. My heart, which had felt so heavy moments before, was suddenly filled with a strange, fierce resolve. I started the car, pulled out onto the road, and drove straight to the airport. I was going to prove them wrong. I booked a one-way ticket to California. It was the furthest I could get from Boston without leaving the country. It was the only place I wanted to go. The wine industry had always fascinated me, a world of tradition, art, and science, all wrapped up in a bottle. In my darkest moments, it had been the one thing I held on to, the one dream that was truly mine. I arrived in Napa Valley a week later, my single suitcase, feeling both impossibly light and heavy with the weight of my past. I found a small family-owned vineyard called the Rustic Acre. It was owned by an older gentleman named Mr. Henderson. He had a kind face and gnarled hands that told a story of a lifetime spent in the sun. He looked at me, a girl from Boston with no experience, and saw something in my eyes. A desperation, a fire, a longing to learn. He gave me a job pruning vines and cleaning out barrels. The pay was low, the work was backbreaking, but I loved every second of it. I would get up at sunrise and work until my hands ached, and for the first time in my life I felt completely at peace. Mr. Henderson taught me everything. He taught me how to read the vines, how to feel the soil, how to listen to the whisper of the wind through the leaves. He taught me the history of winemaking, the science of fermentation, the art of blending. He was a patient teacher, and I was a ravenous student. The more I learned, the more I realized that this was what I was meant to do. This was my purpose. It was at the Rustic Acre that I met Ryan for the first time. He was a consultant, a genius in marketing with a deep passion for wine that rivaled my own. He was there helping Mr. Henderson with a new marketing campaign for a limited edition Merlot. We bonded instantly, spending our lunch breaks talking about everything from the chemistry of tannins to the history of the Bordeaux region. He saw the potential in my knowledge, in my dreams, in me. He was the first person who ever truly listened when I talked about my passion. He told me that my love for the industry was a rare thing, that it was a story waiting to be told. After a few months, Ryan and I started talking about the future. I told him about a crazy idea I had to start a company that focused on high-quality, small-batch wines that told a story. He listened intently, his eyes shining with excitement. "That's not a crazy idea, Alexis," he said, his voice full of conviction. "That's a brilliant idea. A lot of these big wineries are losing their soul. They're just factories. People want to connect with their wine. They want to feel a part of the journey." We started small, calling our company Red Vineyards. We saved every penny we could, working long hours and living on next to nothing. We were happy. We were building something together. It was hard, but it was ours. The business grew slowly but steadily. We started with one small plot of land and a handful of vines, and within 2 years we had a small team and a reputation for making some of the best wine in the area. We worked as a true partnership, Ryan, handling the marketing and business side of things, and me in the vineyard, making sure every grape was perfect. Our biggest break came when a respected wine magazine wrote a small feature about us. The article called our wine a hidden gem and praised our dedication to quality. The phone started ringing off the hook. We were so busy we could barely keep up with the orders. We were on the cusp of something big, but we needed capital to expand. We needed to buy more land, more barrels, more equipment. That's when George Miller came into our lives. He was a seasoned businessman, a man with a lot of experience and a lot of money. He told us he had read the article and was impressed with our work. He offered us a deal, one that seemed too good to be true. He would give us a massive investment in exchange for a partnership. He promised to help us grow our business, to make it a global brand. Ryan was a little wary, but I was so blinded by the chance to build a real empire to prove to my family that I wasn't just a garbage man that I couldn't see the red flags. George made us sign a mountain of paperwork. I remember Ryan looking over the contract, a worried frown on his face. I had told him not to worry. George seemed so nice. I was so wrong. He seemed so nice. I was so wrong. The change wasn't dramatic at first. It was subtle. It began with the little things. George would stop showing up at the vineyard, claiming he had more important meetings in the city. Then the financial reports he sent us started to look a little different. He would say we were spending too much on things he deemed unnecessary, like new barrels or better irrigation systems, even though they were vital for the quality of our wine. His texts became terse and demanding. I would ask a question about our budget or a new hire, and he'd just send a thumbs up or a short, unhelpful reply. Ryan noticed it too, but we were both so busy, so excited about the growth, that we chalked it up to George just being a busy man. The first big red flag came during a meeting we had in his office in San Francisco. He had a glass of our Merlot on his desk, but he wasn't drinking it. He was just swirling it around. He leaned back in his leather chair, and a sly smile spread across his face. "You know Red Vineyards is growing faster than I expected," he said, and my heart swelled with pride. "So fast, in fact, that it might be getting a little out of your hands." He said as if it were a dirty word. I didn't understand what he meant until he pulled out a copy of our original contract, a document that was 100 pages long. He pointed to a small clause in the appendix. It was a convoluted piece of legal jargon buried deep in the fine print. It basically said that if we, as the original owners, failed to meet certain growth projections or spent money on things George considered non-essential, he had the right to buy out our shares at a fraction of their market value. My blood ran cold. I felt sick. It was a trap, a contingency plan. All along he had been setting us up to fail. He had made us sign a document that gave him a back door to take our business, the business we had poured our lives into, for next to nothing. The niceness, the mentorship, the compliments. It was all a show. He was never interested in being a partner. He was interested in being an owner. The next few weeks were a nightmare. Ryan and I went over every piece of paper we had ever signed with George. We went through every single financial transaction, every text message, every email. We had to prove that we were doing everything by the book, that he was the one trying to cheat us. We worked around the clock. The stress was overwhelming. I couldn't sleep. I would wake up in the middle of the night, my mind racing, the image of my father's smug face at the Christmas party flashing in my head. I was so desperate to prove him wrong, so desperate to succeed, that I had been blinded by a man who was just a different kind of monster. A monster in an expensive suit. One night, Ryan found the smoking gun. It was a series of emails from George to his lawyer dated just a few weeks after we signed the contract. In the emails, George was already discussing his plan to take over Red Vineyards. He was already talking about changing the name of the company, about firing our staff, about turning our small, intimate winery into a giant, impersonal factory. The emails were chilling. They were proof of his malicious intent. My hands shook as I read them. All of my fears were confirmed. My misplaced trust, my desperate need for validation, had led me down a dark and dangerous path. Ryan saw the look on my face and put his arms around me. "We're going to fight this, Lex," he said, his voice full of a quiet resolve that calmed me more than anything else could. "We have the proof." He has no idea how hard we're going to fight. We're not going to let him do this to us." His words were a lifeline. I looked at him, at his tired eyes and his determined face, and I knew he was right. I wasn't going to let this man, this wolf in sheep's clothing, take everything we had built. Not after what I had already been through. Not after I had already won my freedom from my family. I wouldn't let another person take it from me. We had to hire a lawyer. We had to fight. We were going to war. We went to war. The first step was finding a good lawyer, a process that felt as daunting as going to war itself. We couldn't afford a huge firm in San Francisco. Their fees alone would bankrupt us before we ever set foot in a courtroom. We had to find someone who believed in us, who was willing to take on a well-connected and wealthy businessman like George Miller. Ryan spent days making phone calls, explaining our story over and over again, only to be met with polite refusals. It was a common problem for small business owners, we learned. Big firms didn't want to get tangled up in a long, drawn-out legal fight with a powerful man like George, especially for a small-time client. Then we found Sarah Jenkins. She was a solo practitioner in a small office in Sacramento. She was a no-nonsense kind of woman with a sharp mind and an even sharper wit. She had a history of taking on big corporations and winning. We sat in her office and told her our story, showing her the email chain we had from George, the one where he talked about his plan to take over our company. She read them all, her face, a mask of stone. When she finished, she looked at me, her eyes seeing right through me. "This isn't just about money, is it?" she said, her voice low. "This is personal." I felt my cheeks flush. I had been so focused on the legal battle that I hadn't realized how much of my emotional baggage I had carried into this fight. He made me feel foolish," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "He made me feel like I was just a kid playing in the dirt all over again." Sarah nodded. "I see. It's a common tactic. They make you feel small so you don't fight back." She took a deep breath. "But you're going to fight back. We're going to make sure this man never gets away with this again. You've got an airtight case and we're going to use it." The next few months were the hardest of my life. The legal battle was a beast. It was a constant barrage of motions, depositions, and demands for paperwork. George's lawyers were merciless. They tried to wear us down, to bleed us dry financially. We spent every last penny we had on legal fees. We had to take out a second mortgage on our small home. We were terrified we were going to lose everything. My hands would shake every time I had to sign a check for a legal bill. My family, of course, found out about the lawsuit. My mom, Eleanor, called me one day, her voice full of a brittle kind of concern. "Alexis, darling, I heard about this lawsuit. Robert and I are so worried about you. Are you sure you're doing the right thing? Your father says it's just a waste of time and money." "Mom, he tried to steal our business," I said, my voice tight. "We have proof." "But darling, he's a very powerful man," she said, ignoring what I had just said. "And you're just a girl who makes wine. He says you have no chance. Please just settle. Come back home." I hung up the phone. Her call, instead of hurting me, just filled me with a quiet, icy resolve. They wanted me to fail. They had always wanted me to fail. This wasn't about the lawsuit, it was about them being right. It was about them proving to me that I wasn't good enough, that I should have stayed in Boston and become a lawyer like Jessica. But I wasn't a girl who made wine anymore. I was a business owner who was fighting for her livelihood. Ryan and I worked harder than ever. We put in 18-hour days, sleeping on the couch in my office, showering at the gym. We were a team. We were in this together. He would sit with me for hours, going over legal documents, helping me find the little details, the little inconsistencies that would prove our case. We were fighting not just for our business, but for our future, for our very right to exist in the world on our own terms. The day of the trial, I walked into the courtroom, my hands shaking. George Miller was there, in a perfectly tailored suit, looking every bit the confident, ruthless businessman he was. He gave me a sneer that said, "You can't win," but I wasn't intimidated. I had Sarah by my side, and I had a truth that was on my side. The trial was long and grueling. We went through every single email, every piece of paperwork. Sarah was a force of nature. She was relentless, tearing apart every single argument George's lawyers made. She was methodical, brilliant, and so damn good at her job. When the judge announced the verdict, I held my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I looked at Ryan, his hand clenched tightly in mine, and then I heard it. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff Alexis Reed. The words were a beautiful song. A perfect, beautiful, magical song. I burst into tears. I had won. The words echoed in my ears and washed over me like a warm wave. I had won. Ryan squeezed my hand so tightly I thought my bones might break. I was crying, but these were not tears of pain or sadness. They were tears of pure, unadulterated relief. I looked at Ryan, his eyes shining with a mix of pride and joy, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I felt completely and utterly free. The weight of the lawsuit, the stress, the fear, the sleepless nights spent poring over legal documents, it all just evaporated. We walked out of the courtroom, the winter sun, feeling impossibly bright on my face. George Miller walked right past us, his face a thundercloud of fury. He didn't say a word, didn't even look at me. It was the most satisfying moment of my life. I didn't feel a need to gloat. The verdict was all the gloating I would ever need. Ryan and I went back to our little house in Napa. We didn't have a big celebration, no fancy dinner or expensive champagne. We just sat on our back porch watching the sun set over the vineyards, a feeling of quiet contentment settling over us. We had a glass of our own wine, and for the first time in a very long time, it tasted like victory. The first thing we did was rebrand the company. The name Red Vineyards felt tainted, too closely associated with George Miller and the pain he had caused us. We wanted a name that was a true reflection of us, of the journey we had taken, of the blood, sweat, and tears we had poured into the soil. We spent a week throwing around ideas, sitting up late at night in our small office, our hands full of our notebooks. Finally, Ryan said it. Harvest and Stone, he said, and I knew instantly that it was the perfect name. It was about the harvest from the earth and the stone from the land. It was a perfect symbol of our journey, of our love for the land, and of our resilience. The new name gave us a fresh start. We were no longer defined by the lawsuit or by the betrayal of a ruthless businessman. We were defined by our own success. The vineyards flourished, and our wine started to win awards. Our little company, the one my father and sister had called a hobby, was starting to get noticed. The articles started to pour in. The phone started ringing again, this time with legitimate offers from big-name distributors. It was a whirlwind, but this time we were ready for it. We were smarter. We were stronger. We were a team. One evening, after a particularly long day of harvesting, we were sitting on a hill overlooking the vineyards, the sky, a beautiful shade of pink and purple. I was tired but so happy. Ryan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. My heart stopped. I knew what was happening before he even said a word. He didn't get down on one knee. He just looked at me, his eyes full of love, and said, "Alexis, I've loved you since the day you showed up at the rustic acre, a girl with fire in her eyes and dirt on her hands. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" I didn't hesitate. "Yes," I said, a tear of pure joy running down my cheek. 1,000 times yes. Our wedding was nothing like the ones my family would have had. There were no hundreds of guests, no lavish ballrooms, no fancy dinners. It was just a small, intimate ceremony on the vineyard with a handful of our closest friends. Our best friend, a judge, officiated the ceremony. I wore a simple white dress, and Ryan wore a suit he'd been saving for a special occasion. We stood under a canopy of oak trees, the sun filtering through the leaves, and we said our vows. It was the most perfect day of my life. It was a day that was all ours, with no pretense, no expectations, no judgment. It was about love, and it was about the life we were building together, brick by brick, row by row. It was a day that cemented our bond, not just as business partners, but as true life partners. We were two people who had found each other on a difficult path, and we were determined to walk the rest of it together. Our wedding was the most perfect day of my life. It was a day that was all ours, with no pretense, no expectations, no judgment. It was about love, and it was about the life we were building together, brick by brick, row by row. We were two people who had found each other on a difficult path, and we were determined to walk the rest of it together. 5 years went by faster than I ever thought possible. We built our lives not on the foundation of what we had, but on the foundation of who we were. We were a team in every sense of the word. We worked together in the vineyards, our hands in the rich soil, our hearts in perfect harmony. Our daughter Olivia came into our lives like a beam of sunshine, and every moment with her felt like a precious gift. She had my quiet spirit, but Ryan's infectious laugh, and watching her grow was the greatest joy I had ever known. She would toddle through the vineyards, her small hands reaching out to touch the heavy bunches of grapes, her little voice a happy echo in the quiet fields. We were a family in a way I had never known. Our mornings were filled with the simple magic of her laughter, and the smell of fresh coffee, and the cool air coming off the vines. Our evenings were spent sitting on our back porch, watching the sun set our little girl asleep in her crib. It was a kind of peace I never thought was possible. Our little company, Harvest and Stone, had grown into something I never could have imagined. What started as a small plot of land and a few barrels was now an empire. We had expanded, buying new vineyards in Oregon and Washington state, each with its own unique soil and climate. Our wine was now on the menu at some of the most prestigious restaurants in New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. We weren't just a small family-owned business anymore. We were a major player in the American wine industry. Our Merlot had won a gold medal at the San Francisco International Wine Competition, and our Chardonnay had been named one of the top 10 in the country by a leading wine blog. We had been featured in small magazines before, but nothing had prepared me for the call I got one sunny afternoon. I was in my office, which was in a little cottage on the edge of our largest vineyard, when my phone rang. I saw the caller ID was from an unfamiliar New York number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something told me to answer. Alexis Reed, a woman's voice, asked, crisp and professional. "My name is Penelope Davies. I'm a senior editor at Vintage Life magazine." My breath caught in my throat. Vintage Life was the holy grail of the wine and food world. A cover story in their magazine was the kind of thing most people in our industry dreamed of for a lifetime. My mind raced, trying to process her words. A feature story. On us. "We've been following your work for a while now," she continued, "and we are beyond impressed. Your focus on sustainability and your unique approach to winemaking is truly remarkable. We'd like to do a feature story on you and your company, a big one. The cover story, in fact." I was speechless. I just stared at the phone. My heart was pounding 1,000,000 miles a minute. A small part of me, that old wounded part, was terrified. I was afraid of the attention, of the scrutiny of my family seeing my success. The last time I was in a room with them, I was being publicly humiliated. I couldn't imagine a world where my father Robert would have to see me on the cover of a magazine. It felt too dangerous, too vulnerable. Penelope must have sensed my hesitation. "I can send you a copy of our last issue if you'd like," she said kindly. "We'd love to tell your story. Your journey is so inspiring, so uniquely American. We think our readers would be fascinated by it." "Can I call you back?" I finally managed to say, my voice barely a whisper. "I need to talk to my husband." I hung up and just sat there, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. I was caught between my pride in everything we had accomplished and a deep-seated fear of being exposed, of being judged again. I had built a life so far away from them, a life that was so perfectly mine. I didn't want their world to bleed into mine. When Ryan came home, I told him everything. He listened patiently, his hand resting on my shoulder as I told him about the call, about my fear, about the past. "Alexis," he said, his voice as gentle as always, "this isn't about them. This is about you. This is about everything you have built with your own 2 hands. You have a right to be proud of your story. This is your chance to tell it on your own terms, not their terms, not a magazine's terms, your terms." He was my emotional anchor. He reminded me of the promise I had made to myself in my car parked on a snowy street in Boston, the promise to prove them wrong. I looked at him, at his unwavering support, and I knew he was right. My father's words, his hateful comments, they had lived inside me for so long, a ghost in the machine. This was my chance to finally lay that ghost to rest. To prove that I was not a garbage man, that I was not an embarrassment, that I was a woman who had built an empire from the ground up. This wasn't about revenge, not really. This was about reclamation. I was reclaiming my name, my story, my self-worth. I picked up the phone and I called Penelope back. "I'm in," I said. "Let's tell my story." The day the magazine hit the stands, I was completely unprepared. Penelope had called to tell me the issue was out, and I had a moment of pure, unadulterated terror. But Ryan held my hand and said, "No turning back now." I took a deep breath, and together, we drove to a small newsstand in town. There it was, on the cover of Vintage Life magazine. A full-page photo of Ryan and me standing in our vineyard, the setting sun turning the sky into a canvas of orange and pink. The headline was in bold, elegant script, "From the Earth Up, the Unlikely Empire of Alexis Reed." My heart hammered in my chest. I bought a copy, my hands shaking as I paid the cashier. We drove back to the vineyard and I sat in the car reading the article. I hadn't read it yet. The writer had interviewed me for weeks and I had poured my heart out to her. She had a way of asking questions that made you want to tell her everything. I read the story and it was beautiful. It was a story of a young woman with a dream, a young woman who was told she wasn't good enough, who was told her dreams were nothing more than a childish hobby. It talked about my love for the soil, for the grapes, for the quiet peace of the vineyard. It talked about the lawsuit with George, about how we fought and won against a man who wanted to take it all away. It was all there. My entire life laid out on the pages of a national magazine. It was my truth told on my own terms. I looked at Ryan, who was smiling at me from the driver's seat. "It's perfect," I said, a tear of joy running down my cheek. She got it all right. She got me right. We didn't know it then, but the article was going viral. The story of a small-town girl who had built an empire from the ground up was exactly what the world needed to hear. The phone started ringing around noon. It was an old college friend I hadn't spoken to in years. "Oh my God, Alexis," she said, her voice full of excitement. "I saw you on Instagram. You're a rock star." I was confused. I didn't even have an Instagram. I went to Ryan's phone, and I looked at his feed. Our story was everywhere. People were sharing it, commenting on it, tagging each other in it. It was a whirlwind. Then my phone rang again. It was my mother. I hesitated for a moment. I hadn't spoken to her since the Christmas Eve party. I took a deep breath and answered. Her voice was full of a brittle kind of excitement, a kind of excitement I had never heard before. "Alexis, darling," she said, her voice a little too loud, a little too strained. "We saw the magazine. Your father, he's just speechless. It's on every newsstand. You're a celebrity." I didn't say anything. I just let her talk. I could hear my dad in the background, his voice a low grumble. I could hear my sister Jessica talking loudly about something in the background, a strange, strained quality to her voice. My mother kept talking, asking me questions about the vineyards, about the award we had won, about Ryan. She was trying so hard to sound like a proud mother, but it felt forced, unnatural. It was clear she hadn't known any of this. It was clear she had no idea what I had been doing for the last 5 years. "Mom," I finally said, my voice quiet. "I need to go. I'll call you later." I hung up the phone before she could say another word. I was done. I was done with the games, with the polite lies, with the pretense. I just wanted to be a person, not a headline. I put my phone on silent and I went back to the vineyards. I walked through the rows of vines, the sun warm on my skin, the scent of the earth a comfort to my soul. This was my world. This was my life. The one I had built with my own 2 hands. The one my family had no part in. But a few hours later I saw I had a dozen missed calls. My mother, my father, even Jessica. They were all calling me, all desperate to talk. I knew what they wanted. They wanted to be a part of my story now. They wanted to claim a piece of my success, and I knew with a sinking feeling that the hard part had just begun. The hard part had just begun. I muted my phone and put it in a drawer in my office. The thought of answering the calls from my parents and Jessica was nauseating. I had spent so many years trying to get their attention, trying to prove I was worth something. Now that I had, they were falling over themselves to get a piece of it. It was a victory, but a hollow one. The taste of triumph was soured by the bitter, all too familiar feeling of being used. I just wanted to go back to my quiet, happy life, to my family, to my vineyard. I wanted to be forgotten again. 2 days later, my phone started ringing again. This time it was a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer it, but something told me to. I picked it up. A voice I knew all too well was on the other end. It was Jessica. Her voice was strained a little too high, a little too breathless. "Alexis," she said, her voice a rush of words. "Thank God you finally answered. I've been trying to get a hold of you for days." I didn't say anything, I just waited. I could feel her frustration on the other end of the line. She wasn't calling to apologize. She was calling because she needed something. "Did you know the article went viral?" she said, her voice a little too loud. "Everyone at my firm is talking about it. They're all congratulating me on having such a brilliant and successful sister. It's so humiliating." I almost laughed. This was the same woman who had laughed at me when I told her I was going to work in the wine industry. The same woman who had a special little party for her law school acceptance. The same woman who had looked at me with smug satisfaction as my father called me a garbage man. And now she was complaining to me about being humiliated. "Humiliating," I finally said. "Why is that humiliating, Jessica? You're a lawyer. You should be proud of your sister." "It's not that simple, Alexis," she said, her voice now a whine. "They don't understand. They don't get that you're just you. And I'm me. They keep asking me why I'm not a partner yet. They keep saying, 'Oh, if your sister can build a company worth 8 figures, surely you can handle a little partnership.' It's a nightmare." I felt a strange pang of something that was a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. I had never wanted to hurt her, to bring her down. But now she was paying the price for her own condescension. I thought about the thousands of hours I had put in, the sleepless nights, the days spent digging in the dirt. I thought about the lawsuit, the stress, the fear, and I thought about how she had been sitting in her comfortable office living a comfortable life while I was fighting for my very survival. "I don't know what to tell you, Jessica," I said, my voice quiet. "I don't have a magic wand." "But you do," she said, her voice now a little softer, a little more desperate. "You're a genius. You built an empire from nothing. You know how to play the game. I don't." She paused for a moment, and I could hear her take a shaky breath. "I'm just so tired, Alexis. All my life I've been trying to be the perfect daughter. I went to law school. I got a good job. I've done everything they've ever asked of me. But it's never enough. I just want to make them happy. But nothing I do ever feels like it's my own. I just want to live my own life, but I don't even know what that is." I was stunned. I had never heard her talk like that before. All my life I had thought she was the one who had it all. The perfect grades, the perfect job, the perfect life. But underneath it all, she was just as lost as I was. She was trapped in the same gilded cage, just in a different room. I took a deep breath. "Jessica," I said, my voice softer now. "I can't tell you how to be happy. That's something you have to figure out on your own. But I can tell you this. When you're building a life to please other people, you're not really building a life at all. You're building a prison. You're building a prison." I hung up the phone and stood there for a long time. Her words, her admission of being trapped by my parents' expectations, echoed in my head. I had always thought Jessica had everything, but in a way she was just as lost as I was. A sudden wave of sadness washed over me. I hadn't wanted this. I hadn't wanted to prove my family wrong just so my sister could be miserable. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about something bigger. It was about healing. I called my parents and arranged a dinner. Not in Boston, not at their house, but in New York. A neutral territory where I felt I had the upper hand. I wanted them to come to me. I booked a private room at a high-end restaurant in Manhattan, a place I knew they'd be impressed by, a place that served my wine. The irony was not lost on me. I asked Ryan to come with me, not just for support, but to show them that I wasn't alone, that I had a family of my own now, a real family. They were late, of course. My dad Robert looked uncomfortable in his suit, his face a little flushed. My mom Eleanor was wearing a new dress, her face a mask of nervous excitement. Jessica was quiet, she didn't meet my eyes. The conversation was stilted and awkward at first. My mom tried to make small talk about the weather, about the flight. My dad just grunted in response. I sat there quietly observing them, a small smile on my face. They were so out of their element, so uncomfortable. It was a strange kind of power. When the waiter brought out our wine, a beautiful bottle of Harvest and Stone Merlot, my dad's eyes widened. He picked it up and read the label, his brow furrowed in concentration. He put the bottle down and a long, uncomfortable silence filled the room. This was it. This was the moment. My dad cleared his throat, a deep rumbling sound that filled the room. Alexis, he said, his voice a little shaky. We saw the article. It was quite something. I didn't say anything. I just waited. I had been waiting for this moment for years. He looked at my mom, who just nodded. He looked at Jessica, who was still staring at her lap. He looked at Ryan, and then finally he looked at me. I don't know what to say, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I have thought about that Christmas Eve for years. I have thought about what I said, and what I did. I was a fool. I was so caught up in what I thought was success, in what I thought the world expected of me, that I couldn't see what was right in front of me. He took a shaky breath, his eyes filling with tears. I grew up with nothing, he said, his voice raw with emotion. I worked my whole life to build something, to be something. I wanted that for you girls too. I wanted you to have a life that was easy, a life that was comfortable. I wanted you to be successful, but I had a very narrow view of what success was. I saw a lawyer, I saw a doctor, I saw a banker. I didn't see an artist. I didn't see a dreamer. I didn't see you. My heart ached for him. It was a strange feeling, a mix of old hurt and new understanding. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man who had been defined by his own past, by his own fears. He was a man who had built a prison for himself, and had tried to put us in it too. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a grief so profound it almost took my breath away. I was wrong, he said, his voice cracking. I was so terribly wrong. I was proud of you then, I just couldn't say it. And I am proud of you now. I am so terribly, terribly proud of you. And I am so sorry. I am so sorry I called you a garbage man. My mom Eleanor reached out and put a hand on my dad's arm, her eyes full of tears. She looked at me, her face a mixture of relief and regret. We were worried about you, Alexis, she said, her voice soft. We thought you had run away from home to go play in the dirt. We never imagined you were building something so beautiful. Your father was worried people would laugh at him because he raised a child who chose to go against his will. He was so caught up with what other people thought, with what his friends would say, that he lost sight of what mattered. I looked at all of them, at my mom, at my dad, at my sister, who was still staring at her lap, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see my father as a monster. I just saw a man who had made a mistake, a man who was finally, after all these years, brave enough to admit it. A man who was finally, after all these years, brave enough to admit it. The moment hung in the air, heavy with 1,000 unspoken emotions. My mom Eleanor had tears in her eyes. Jessica was still silent, but I could feel a shift in her. I looked at my dad, at the man who had caused me so much pain, and a wave of calm washed over me. I wasn't angry anymore. The words he had said had been so painful, but his admission of regret was so genuine, it was a balm to a wound that had festered for years. I accept your apology, Dad, I said, my voice soft but firm, and I'm glad you said it, but it doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't erase the years of feeling like I wasn't enough. It's a start, but we have a long way to go. My father just nodded, his eyes full of a profound sadness. He knew I was right. There was no magic wand that could fix years of hurt with a single apology. The rest of the dinner was quiet. My parents tried to talk about the magazine article, about how proud they were, but their pride felt a little awkward, a little forced. Jessica was still quiet, but when she did speak, it was to ask me about the process of making wine, about the soil and the vines. It was a small step, but it was a step. A few days later, I was back in California. My phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer it. It was a man's voice on the other end, a lawyer who said he was representing his client, a woman named Susan, who had an important message for me. My stomach clenched. I had no idea who Susan was, and the last thing I wanted was another legal battle. But the lawyer insisted, saying it was a matter of extreme importance. I told him to have his client call me directly, and an hour later my phone rang again. A woman's voice, tired but full of a quiet rage, said, "Alexis, my name is Susan. I'm George Miller's ex-wife." My heart jumped into my throat. George Miller, the man who had tried to steal everything from me. I had put him out of my mind. The lawsuit was over. We had won. What could she possibly want? "I'm calling because I want to help you," she said, her voice shaking with anger. I just found out what he did. I just found out he was a fraud. He was a fraud to me, and he was a fraud to you. And I want to make sure he never gets away with it again. She went on to explain how George had hidden a mountain of debt from her during their divorce proceedings. She had just hired a new accountant, and the accountant had found a hidden account, a slush fund George had used for bribes and underhanded deals. She had found a stash of emails, documents, and recordings. She told me she had evidence that proved George was planning to defraud us even before he had met with us. She had evidence that he had a network of corrupt lawyers and accountants he had been working with for years, and that our lawsuit was just one of many. I sat there stunned. All this time I had thought I had won, but I hadn't even scratched the surface of the man's depravity. Susan told me that her evidence was a smoking gun, a final nail in his coffin. She said she was going to turn it over to the state authorities, but she wanted to make sure I had a copy. She wanted to make sure I was safe, and that I had the power to make sure he never hurt anyone else again. I didn't feel a sense of triumph. I didn't feel a sense of revenge. I just felt a quiet, overwhelming sense of responsibility. This wasn't about me anymore. This was about all the other people George had hurt, all the other small business owners, all the other ex-wives. My victory was not the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a new one. I thanked Susan, my voice full of a gratitude I couldn't express. We agreed to meet in a few days. I hung up the phone and just stood there, my mind racing. I was no longer fighting for myself. I was fighting for justice. And I knew with a sudden beautiful clarity that this was what my life was meant to be. This was my purpose. I knew with a sudden beautiful clarity that this was what my life was meant to be. This was my purpose. I met with Susan just as we had arranged. She was a kind, tired woman who looked at me with a gratitude that broke my heart. She handed me a thick binder of documents and a flash drive. "He can't get away with this," she said, her voice shaking. "He can't. Not again." I looked at the evidence, at the emails and the financial records, and I felt a sense of calm. This was not about revenge. This was about justice. I helped her take the evidence to the authorities, and a few weeks later George Miller was arrested on charges of fraud and embezzlement. I didn't feel a sense of triumph. I just felt a quiet relief. The man who had tried to steal everything from me was finally getting what he deserved, and I had been a small part of that. My family's transformation was more subtle. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was a beginning. A few months later, my parents flew out to California to visit me. They came to the vineyard. My dad, Robert, walked through the rows of vines, his hands in his pockets, and I could tell he was trying to understand. He didn't make any more comments about my work. He just looked at it with a quiet, respectful wonder. He asked me about the process, about the fermentation, about the soil. He was trying in his own way to connect with me. He was trying to find common ground in a world he had once seen as a foreign country. My mom, Eleanor, spent the whole day doting on Olivia, our daughter. She just kept saying, "Oh, Alexis, she's so beautiful. She looks just like you." She was more relaxed, more present than I had ever seen her. I realized that my success had not only freed me, but it had also freed them from the prison of their own expectations. They no longer had to pretend they had a perfect lawyer daughter. They could just have 2 daughters each with her own path and be proud of them both. Jessica had found a new job too. She had quit her big corporate law firm and taken a job at a small nonprofit that specialized in environmental law. She told me she was working for a cause she actually believed in. She told me she was happy for the first time in her life. She was still Jessica, a little bit competitive, a little bit too loud, but she was a different person. She was a person who was finally, after all these years, brave enough to find her own path. She sent me a long text one day that just said, "I'm sorry, Lex. I'm sorry for everything. You were right. My life was a prison." I just wrote back, "I'm proud of you, Jess." I had once thought that my revenge would be a grand theatrical moment. I thought it would be my father's face as he saw me on the cover of a magazine. I thought it would be the look in Jessica's eyes when she saw how successful I was. But I was wrong. My revenge was not about their humiliation. My revenge was about my own happiness. It was about waking up every morning and feeling a sense of peace. It was about seeing my daughter's face every day and knowing that she was growing up in a home full of love, a home where she was celebrated for exactly who she was. My father had called me a garbage man, but I had built an empire from the dirt. He had called me a disappointment, but I had found a purpose that was bigger than anything he could have ever imagined for me. He had cast me out, but in doing so he had set me free. My life had become a testament to the fact that your worth is never determined by someone else's opinion of you. It is determined by the life you build for yourself, brick by brick, row by row. It is determined by your heart. And for the first time in my life, my heart was full. My life is not a perfect fairy tale. We still have bad days, and my family and I still have things to work through. But we're trying. We're a family who is finally, after all these years, learning to see each other for who we truly are. I am still the quiet one, and Jessica is still the loud one, but we are both happy. And in the end, that's all that matters. My story is just one of many. Have you ever experienced being underestimated or overlooked by those closest to you? How did you respond? Did you try to prove yourself to them, or did you find your validation from within? Share your stories with me in the comments below. If my story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. I'm going to be sharing more stories of resilience, of love, and of the incredible power of a life lived on your own terms. Thank you for listening, and I wish you all the courage in the world to be exactly who you are, no matter what.